So thank you, Kyle. It's cool to be a part of the series as we start to unfold the entire book of James in one 5-hour class. So I have passed out a handout to you, and as we go along, you'll see there are some blanks that you can fill out, and I will be sure that you catch those as we're diving into James chapter 2, verses 10 through 17. We're in the series Walk It Out. It's a study of the book of James. I've titled this one, I kind of swayed a little bit from lights, camera, action to keep in line with our series title, Walk It Out, into Walking in Love and Truth. We are going to look at it in a two-part series, even though we're looking at verse 10. It's kind of picking up on the tail end of where we left off with Kyle, talking about the royal law and opposing discrimination and favoritism. In the first part, we're going to look at that, where it ends with mercy over triumphing over judgment. And then the second part of the teaching is going to be about faith in action, and we're going to look at verses 14 through 17. So, just as a quick recap from what Kyle shared, we have the preceding text that we're going to kind of link into, starts in chapter 2 again, but starting in verse 8, and it says, "If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor," and your neighbor being someone who is near or close, "as yourself, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin, are convicted by the law as lawbreakers." We know that lawbreakers is also speaking to a transgressor or a sinner at that point. So we just want to keep in mind as we're going through that James is really talking in this chapter about the royal law of love, loving your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself, and then he's opposing any kind of discrimination. But we're going to jump into verse 10 here, and it says, "For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles," and you can read right along with me as we dissect this, "and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. For he who said you shall not commit adultery also said you shall not murder. And if you do not commit adultery but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful, but mercy triumphs over judgment." Thank you. So in this, as we look at the big picture of this first part of the text here, we're really talking about, you heard from Kyle a little bit about the believers of that time. It's also believed that these listeners of the letter of James are coming out of persecution, possibly from the beheading of Stephen, and so they've been kind of scattered abroad to the nations. You might have remembered that from some previous series going on today. And basically, that's part of the reason why James is addressing them, that they're under persecution, they're in foreign lands, they're scattered abroad, and so they're having to walk out their faith now in the midst of people who are not maybe like them, maybe don't have the same belief system or are living in a different cultural context. So with that in mind, the Christians of that day had to really shift their thinking. Not only were they coming out of Judaism as they embraced the Messiah, but they were also dealing with walking out their faith. So they went from through Jesus, it switched for them and for us from being made right through an object and ritual practices to self being the sacrifice. We lay down our lives, right? And relationship, which is a righteous living in Jesus and with others. And so you'll see on your paper, the first one is James listeners were new converts facing persecution and living as exiles in foreign nations. And then their switching had to be, their minds had to go from sacrificing animals to laying down their own lives. So if you're on the paper with me, you can fill that right in. And then the second line says, "From perfection and perfect rituals to the matters of the heart and relationship." So you can fill that in if you want as we're moving along. I'm sorry I don't have my PowerPoint for you as I expected, but I think we can roll like this just as fine. So that's kind of the context they were coming from, and they're shifting. But James brings in kind of that, as Kyle mentioned, the whole thinking of the Torah, where he's blending what they know from the Old Testament into how they're having to renew their minds in the New Testament. So he starts in verse 10 by saying, we'll look at that again. Anybody have verse 10 open? Go ahead, Greg, thank you.
For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it.
Go on.
Okay. For he who said, you shall not commit adultery, also said, you shall not murder. If you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker.
You have become a lawbreaker, or a sinner, or a transgressor, right? So if everybody in the room who is a murderer or an adulterer, if you would just raise your hand. We got some honest folks in the room, okay? Because we're followers of Christ, and we know that if we lust with the eye, that we're considered an adulterer. If we hate with our heart, right, we're considered a murderer. But we wouldn't just outright say, I'm an adulterer, I'm a murderer. You know, we kind of like, I don't really want to go there, but, you know, if Jesus said so, then I'll agree. So we're not quick to identify with that. But what we have to remember is that all of those who maybe judged a homeless person, the same family in your congregation who comes week after week needing benevolence, or those maybe who have nothing in common with you, we find ourselves kind of judging those people, and we don't think of that as this huge kind of sin, which is what James is saying, but those are the little stumbling blocks that keep us in the place of a sinner, just the same as the murderer or the adulterer. And so I think that's a common belief that we walk in today, right? Is that, you know, I'm just the same as somebody who's in prison for, you know, doing horrible acts. We're all the same sinner. But back then, they really had, that was a new shift for them. So he was bringing them into that. And so the questions we have to ask ourselves in this context is where do we stumble, you know, in judgment or not being inclusive with other people and that sort of thing. And so that's really one thing that James was bringing to attention. And the truth is, you know, anyone who claims to live by the law of love, but is not showing, even in the small things, love to the big things, is a lawbreaker. So we're not under then the law of love, but we're under the letter of judgment. Therefore, if we judge, we will be
judged.
But if we show mercy and under the law, the royal law of love, we will also receive mercy. We know these things, but I think it's a good reminder because James makes an emphasis here on the word stumble, which is they're the little things that we can groom ourselves into thinking, oh, it's nothing, it's the white lie, it's, you know, something like that. So we want to pay attention to those things. So judgment now is not by the Old Testament law, but by the royal law. Therefore, in verse 12, he picks up by saying, Bobby?
So speak.
Yep, so speak.
And so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty.
Go on.
For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
That's right, mercy triumphs over judgment. And on your paper you'll see, and you can fill in, it says, in essence, James is saying judgment brings judgment and mercy brings mercy. We know that Jesus, his whole, you know, every message that he had was infiltrated with this idea of mercy. He said in the Beatitudes, you know, on the sermon there about blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Even in the Old Testament, they were under the kind of law, the ritual of the law, but at the same time, they were hearing over and over again in their rebellion, look, the only thing I've required of you, it says in Micah, is to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. And so this idea of mercy is very close to the heart of God. And this new law or rule gives freedom to not be perfect, because we know that Jesus was the perfect one, right? And in that, we're able to receive what is undeserved mercy. And so a lot of times we think we can give mercy to the level that we can give it to, but we don't recognize that anyone who's receiving mercy is essentially undeserving of mercy. And so we have to give mercy even to the undeserving. Jesus, again, he ate at Matthew's house, a sinner, and there in Matthew verse 9:13, as he was sitting among them, he's like, it's not the sick, it's not the healthy who need, this, but it's the sick. And then he says, but go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but to call the sinners. So you see over and over again, as believers, we're charged to embrace those that need God, that need Him, that we see. And I had this experience coming home from the church tour. I'm going to incorporate that as well. And it really spoke to me about our time at the one church. But as I was driving home from Faith Assembly, those of you who were there, I was having to rush to get to work because some stuff had come up and I wasn't able to get out of the shift like I thought I was going to be able to. And so I waited till the very last minute because I was so excited to be at Faith Assembly. And so I got off on this kind of like quirky exit off of one of the freeways there. And I was in this like awkward space and I had to get gas, I had to get something to eat, and I had to be there in less time than it took to drive there. So I was in a rush. So I pull into the parking lot, and as I drive by, my stomach like sinks as I see an entire family standing in the Publix parking lot holding a sign saying they need help. And I'm like, I'm a heavy foot driver, and so I'm like speeding by practically trying to make my time, and I'm looking like this, and I'm like rolling through the stop sign, probably running people over coming out of Publix, and I'm like, what do I do? Like I have 20 extra minutes on top to fit in where I can't go. And so I was just like, Lord, please send somebody, but I already knew my passage at that time. And I'm like, oh, why are you doing this to me, Lord? And so it's the same things, we see that, but at the same time, you're like, well, why would they have their children out there with them, and why would they, they look like they're doing well, why, and I was joking with a friend earlier, when it comes to judgment, we kind of can't win with people, right? Because it's like, if I'm all dressed junky and I say I need help, you say they're probably going to use it on drugs, because we've all said it. And if I'm dressed all clean and I say I need help, you're probably going to say they don't need it. They don't need it, okay? And so where does that person win? They don't, unless we're willing to extend mercy to those that are undeserving and whose, their situation we can't figure out. So mercy defined, this is at the bottom, and I just want you to fill it in there. It says it's love or compassion. And God's covenant loving kindness is another term that can be defined there. In the Greek, it's hanan. Think I'm saying that correctly? I don't know. But it means compassion, or to draw attention to the response of a person who is able to help another person. And it makes a note in there to say that there's no essence or feeling that the person, sometimes we've heard it preached that Jesus was moved with compassion and he met the person's need, and he was. But this essence of mercy is not even that I have to feel it as the giver of mercy. It's that I know I have to do it. And in the same way that the person who's receiving mercy isn't necessarily having the expectation of like handouts, rather someone who knows I'm thankful and grateful because I know I'm undeserving. And really, when we receive mercy and we know we're undeserving, it's easier for us to give it to someone who's undeserving, because at the same time, we didn't deserve it, right? So the last one there says, overall mercy is given to someone who is, and you can fill that blank in, undeserving. We're going to move on to the second part. But before we do that, let me say this. Let me just challenge you a little bit. And it says, how do we not judge? Because I don't want to move forward without really talking to you about some practical things about how we don't judge, because we find ourselves with that thing in our heart all the time. It's like we kind of got to take those, first of all, you take your thoughts captive and bring it obedient, to Christ. And so we have to do that daily as believers in order to walk in Him. But circumstances sometimes seem so obvious, or maybe we even know the details or the facts of that personally. I was sharing, again, I'll use myself as a personal illustration. I was sharing with Bobby last Monday about something that my family and I have been walking through for some time now. And honestly, some people in my family, they flat out do not deserve my mercy right now. And so the Lord is challenging me in that too, but it's because I think that way because I know the facts. But the facts don't always add up. And when they do, aren't you glad that God did not use the facts of your life against you? You know, and then he extended his mercy towards you. And so to combat judgment, I would challenge you to choose encouragement. The motivator for mercy is not what is always seems to be right according to this world. And the motivator for mercy is most of the time it's all that's wrong. So every time you see something that's wrong, because I'm wearing black and white, and actually when I put it on today, I'm like, that's right, I'm going to be given the word, I'm going to be talking in black and white. But, you know, we think that way as Christians, and especially as ministers, but it's not always black and white with the Lord, because we don't understand as much as he understands. And so even when the circumstances are wrong, right, we have to extend mercy. In God's upside down kingdom, or in this world's upside down kingdom, he looks at us, at our own dirt, at our own wrongdoing, and he extends mercy to us. So I want to challenge you to extend mercy by being willing to be an encourager. And his expectation is that we're going to do that. So especially when it's not deserved, and when the facts are stacked against the person, and when people's circumstances don't add up, or even when they turn you off. Sometimes it's just they're turning you off. Extend mercy. There's something that says, be willing to find the gold in the dirt. Have y'all seen that on Facebook? I can't even think of what it says right now, but it's a really cool little thing. I'll try to show it to you at some time during the break. But we're going to move on to part 2 in faith in action. We're looking at verses 14 through 17 in this part. And it says, just for the sake of time, I really want you to follow along through this teaching, but it says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. And now in this second part, essentially, you look at it in your Bible, it's already broken up into 2 parts, and so you think, okay, you know, I'm going to kind of divide my thinking here. But as we dive in, you're going to see that they're a lot more tied together than what you might initially suppose. And so it's neat as we will uncover that. In verse 14, it says, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds, can such faith save them? Well, faith there means faith. It also means to believe, and that's your blank right there. Or belief, excuse me, and then believe and have faith. And I want to bring out that word belief, because if we substitute that word, it would say if someone claims to believe or have belief but has no deeds, can such faith save them? I think that's a good word to substitute right there, because when you break down the word belief, it's actually by life or belief. And so it's what you live your life by. Your faith is going to be how you live your life. And if you say you live one way, but your life does not reflect it, then the logical question that you have to ask yourself is, do I really believe? So I think that's a good word to substitute there in the context of what we're looking at here. And that's a question that I'm going to encourage you to ask yourself as we move through. In verse 15 then, it says, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? Well, we see here, go in peace. The beginning of verse 16 is very common in language there, in the Greek and in the Hebrew. They would say, go in peace all the time, right? Well, it would be like us giving the well wish of, hey, how you doing? Hope all's well. Well, why are you hoping all's well when I'm going through, like, I'm having a breakdown? And you're like, hope all's well, and you take off. So we find ourselves doing that all the time, right? But that's the fill in the blank. Hello, and then hope all's well. That could be a substitute for go in peace, keep warm, and be well fed. James is saying it must be accompanied by an action. That's the word there, on behalf of the well-wisher. Sometimes we can be so, I know you've heard this before, we can be so spiritually minded that we're no earthly good, right? Well, we've been called to demonstrate our